Welcome to Bookbound Audio, where tales come alive through the power of storytelling. Prepare to immerse yourself in The Haunting Curse of Redwood Manor, an eerie and atmospheric thriller that will transport you to 1962 America. Experience the chilling depths of Redwood Manor as narrated by Miguel Vasquez, a passionate history teacher entangled in unraveling a centuries-old curse alongside renowned detective Elliot Brooks. Folklore, rituals, and shadows intertwine in a tale brimming with suspense, paranormal encounters, and shocking revelations. Let the gripping narrative pull you into the haunted halls, where mysteries whisper from the walls, and the past refuses to be forgotten. Dim the lights, settle in, and journey with us through this spine-chilling adventure. Welcome to your escape. Welcome to Bookbound Audio. Happy listening. When I first stepped onto the grounds of Redwood Manor, I was struck by the sheer weight of its presence. It wasn't simply the towering walls, ivy-clad and weathered by decades of neglect, nor the ornate wrought-iron gates that creaked with indignation as they swung open. No, what enveloped me in quiet dread was the stillness, the kind of silence that clings to abandoned places where memories have had too much time to fester. The air hung heavy, laden with the scent of damp earth and something else, something faintly metallic that made the hairs on my neck rise. Elliot Brooks was already there, standing before the manor's imposing entrance, his trench coat dusted with the remnants of the gravel path. As always, he appeared composed, his expression one of perpetual concentration. The faint glow of the setting sun painted his features in amber hues, but there was no warmth in his demeanor, only a resolute focus that had driven him through countless investigations. He turned as he heard my footsteps, offering a curt nod. "You feel it too, don't you?" His voice was low, as though he feared disturbing the unseen. I nodded, though the feeling was difficult to articulate. It wasn't fear, exactly, but an awareness, a sense that Redwood Manor was not merely an architectural relic but something alive, something watching. I adjusted the strap of my leather bag, my notebook and camera tucked inside, and followed Elliot through the heavy wooden door as it groaned in protest. The creak echoed in the vast emptiness beyond, announcing our presence to whatever lay inside. The interior of the manor was oppressive, its grandeur diminished by decades of decay. Chandeliers hung precariously from the ceiling, their crystals dulled and coated in dust, while faded tapestries depicting long-forgotten hunting scenes lined the walls. A grand staircase curved upwards into shadows, each step worn with age. Elliot's flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating particles of dust that floated lazily in the air. "The family's been gathering here for generations," Elliot began, his voice steady but contemplative. "Even with the rumors, they return like moths to a flame." I followed him into the drawing room, where the remnants of a gathering were still evident. A cluster of relatives stood in hushed conversation near the fireplace, their expressions marked by unease. The room itself was opulent but tired, the plush velvet chairs frayed, the gilded frames of ancestral portraits tarnished. I lingered near one portrait in particular, its subject a stern-faced man whose eyes seemed to follow me. There was a sadness etched into his features, a weight that seemed to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. Elliot moved through the room with purpose, engaging the family members with brief, pointed questions. He was masterful in his approach, extracting just enough information to form the beginnings of a narrative while maintaining an air of calm authority. I remained on the periphery, observing the interactions and jotting down notes. "Miguel, over here," Elliot called softly, and I joined him near a cluster of artifacts displayed in a glass case. Among them was a mirror, ornate and haunting in its beauty. Its surface was tarnished, but beneath the grime, the glass seemed to shimmer unnaturally, as though it held more than mere reflections. "What do you make of this?" Elliot asked, his gaze fixed on the mirror. I leaned in, my breath fogging the glass slightly. There was something unsettling about it, something that stirred memories of the stories my grandmother used to tell, tales of mirrors that could trap souls. "It doesn't belong here," I murmured. "It feels out of place, even among the rest." Elliot nodded, his expression unreadable. As we continued to explore the manor, the sense of foreboding grew. The family had dispersed somewhat, leaving us to navigate the corridors alone. Each hallway seemed darker than the last, the shadows deeper, the air colder. We came upon a small study, its door slightly ajar. Inside, a single lamp cast a pale light over the cluttered desk, its surface littered with papers and an open ledger. Elliot moved toward it, his movements deliberate. "This handwriting, it doesn't match any of the family members I've spoken to," he observed. I peered over his shoulder, noting the jagged scrawl that seemed to tremble across the pages. The words were difficult to decipher, but one phrase stood out, asterisk asterisk, "the pact must hold." Asterisk asterisk. Elliot's jaw tightened. He didn't speak, but I could see the wheels turning in his mind, the connections forming. He motioned for me to document the scene, and I obliged, snapping photographs and making detailed notes. There was something deeply unsettling about that phrase. It wasn't simply the implication of an agreement, it was the sense of desperation in the words, a plea to maintain something that should never have been forged. We left the study and ventured deeper into the manor, our footsteps echoing faintly. It was then that we heard it, a low, mournful sound, like the cry of a distant wind. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, resonating through the wood and stone. I froze, my pulse quickening. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, and Elliot nodded, his expression grim. "The house," he said simply. "It's speaking." The sound grew louder as we approached the dining hall, its grand table set with tarnished silverware and faded linens. The room was empty, but the presence was palpable. I felt as though I were being watched, though no eyes were visible. Elliot moved toward the far end of the table, where a single chair was turned askew. Beneath it lay a scrap of paper, its edges singed. He crouched to retrieve it, holding it up to the light. The writing was faint, but the words were clear, asterisk asterisk sacrifice. Asterisk asterisk. The chill in the air deepened, and I could see my breath in the dim light. Elliot pocketed the scrap and turned to me, his voice low and steady. "Miguel, we're not alone here." His words weren't meant to frighten, they were a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of the unseen forces that had begun to reveal themselves. We spent the remainder of the evening piecing together clues, whispers of a bloodline cursed by an ancient pact, relics that seemed to pulse with energy, and accounts from family members who spoke of shadowy figures glimpsed in the corners of their vision. The manor was alive in ways I couldn't fully comprehend, its very walls steeped in the echoes of its dark history. As the night wore on, I found myself drawn to the mirror once more. I stood before it, my reflection distorted by the tarnished surface. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, something behind me, something that vanished when I turned. My heart raced, and I stepped back, nearly colliding with Elliot. He placed a steadying hand on my shoulder, his eyes sharp. "Stay close," he said, and I nodded, my voice caught in my throat. By the time we left the manor, the air outside felt lighter, though the weight of what we had uncovered remained. Elliot was silent as we walked to his car, his mind undoubtedly sorting through the fragments of the puzzle we had begun to assemble. I glanced back at the manor, its windows now dark and vacant. It felt as though it were watching us, waiting for our return. I climbed into the passenger seat, my notebook heavy in my lap. "What now?" I asked, though I knew Elliot didn't have the answer, not yet. He started the engine, the rumble breaking the silence. "Now," he said, his voice firm, "we find out what Redwood Manor is hiding." And with that, we drove away, the shadows of the manor lingering in the rearview mirror like ghosts. The hum of the car's engine had faded into the night, leaving us in near silence as we stood before the gates of Redwood Manor once more. The iron gate creaked open as Elliot pushed against it, his gloved hand steady and deliberate. The air felt heavier tonight, colder, as though the manor had drawn in a breath of dread and was holding it deep within its ancient walls. I pulled my coat tighter around me, the weight of the camera strap slung across my shoulder offering little comfort. Elliot was already ahead of me, his flashlight cutting through the thick shadows that spilled across the grounds. He moved with purpose, his silhouette a sharp contrast against the muted glow of the moonlight. As I hurried to catch up, my boots crunching against the gravel seemed louder than they should have been, as if the manor had amplified every sound, its silence swallowing each echo whole. "Tonight will be different," Elliot said, his voice low but resolute. I could see the intensity in his eyes, a gleam that suggested he was braced for the unexpected. "The house, it's awake." His words struck me like a chord, resonating deep in the pit of my stomach. I said nothing but followed him through the door we had entered only hours before, now slightly ajar as though waiting for us. Inside, the darkness seemed deeper, its edges blurred and indistinct. Redwood Manor was a labyrinth of disquiet, its halls stretching endlessly and its rooms steeped in the tangible presence of forgotten histories. "Let's start with the dining room," Elliot suggested, his gaze scanning the corridor before us. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to return to that place. The memory of the eerie chill, the fleeting whispers, and the feeling of eyes watching us from the shadows lingered like an unwanted guest in my mind. The dining room was much as we had left it, but the air had shifted, growing heavier with an almost suffocating stillness. The long table stretched before us, its tarnished silverware gleaming faintly in the sparse light of Elliot's flashlight. My attention was drawn to a chair near the far end, slightly pulled back from the table as if its occupant had risen abruptly. Elliot moved toward it, his boots tapping against the aged wood floor. "Do you see it?" he asked, gesturing toward the chair. I stepped closer, my pulse quickening as I noticed the faint outline of a handprint on the seat's velvet cushion. It was smeared, as though someone, or something, had pressed down with a trembling grasp. I glanced at Elliot, whose expression remained stoic, his focus unwavering. He reached into his coat pocket and produced the scrap of paper we had found earlier. The word "sacrificed" seemed to shimmer in the light, its significance amplifying with every passing moment. "It's all connected," he murmured, almost to himself. "This house, this family, there's something they're not telling us." Before I could respond, a sudden gust of wind swept through the room, rattling the silverware and extinguishing the candles that had been lit by the family earlier in the evening. I froze, my breath caught in my throat as the shadows seemed to deepen, curling around us like dark tendrils. Elliot's flashlight flickered momentarily, casting erratic beams of light across the walls. I could have sworn I saw movement, figures just out of reach, slipping into the periphery of my vision. "Stay close," Elliot said sharply, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. I nodded, clutching my notebook tightly as we stepped back toward the corridor. The wind had settled, but the eerie sensation of being watched remained. My heart pounded against my ribs as we made our way toward the study we had discovered earlier, its door now closed. Elliot pushed the door open, and the room greeted us with a strange stillness. The cluttered desk was undisturbed, the faint scent of aged paper and ink filling the air. But something was different. The ledger we had examined earlier was now closed, its cover dusty as though it hadn't been touched in decades. Elliot approached the desk cautiously, his fingers tracing the edge of the cover. I moved toward the shelves lining the walls, their surfaces crowded with books whose spines bore symbols and titles I could hardly decipher. One book in particular caught my eye, a leather-bound volume adorned with intricate carvings of what looked like serpents intertwined with human figures. I reached for it, the texture of the worn leather rough against my fingertips. As I opened it, a chill ran down my spine. The pages were filled with illustrations of rituals, their details grotesque and unnerving. One image depicted a circle of figures bowing before an altar, their hands outstretched toward a looming shadow that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Miguel, Elliot's voice broke through my focus, pulling me back to the present. He was standing by the desk, holding up a folded piece of paper he had found beneath the ledger. "More writing," he said, handing it to me. The words were faint but legible. Asterisk asterisk, the price must be paid. Asterisk asterisk. I felt my stomach knot as I read the phrase aloud, the weight of its meaning sinking into me. Paid for what? I asked, though I knew Elliot didn't have the answer, not yet. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, breaking the fragile silence. We turned sharply, exchanging a glance before moving toward the doorway. The hall was empty, but the footsteps persisted, growing louder as though someone, or something, was approaching. Elliot raised his flashlight, its beam cutting through the dark and revealing the faint outline of a figure at the far end of the corridor. It was fleeting, its features indistinct, but it was unmistakably human, or at least appeared to be. The figure lingered for only a moment before vanishing into the shadows, leaving behind an unsettling void. Elliot moved quickly, his steps purposeful as he followed the path the figure had taken. I hesitated, my instincts screaming for caution, but I couldn't let him face whatever lay ahead alone. The corridor led us to a door we hadn't noticed before, its surface worn and splintered. Elliot hesitated for a moment before pushing it open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. The air was colder here, the silence even more oppressive. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot didn't answer, his focus fixed on the stairwell as he began to descend. I followed reluctantly, each step feeling like an eternity. The light from his flashlight barely reached the bottom, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. When we finally reached the base, we found ourselves in a small, stone-lined room. The walls were damp, their surfaces etched with more of the symbols we had seen earlier. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, its surface cracked but stable. Upon it lay a small box, its lid adorned with the same serpent-like carvings I had seen in the book. Elliot approached it cautiously, his hand steady as he lifted the lid. Inside was an amulet, its surface dark and tarnished. He held it up to the light, its intricate design shimmering faintly. "This is it," he said, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "This is what's binding them." Before I could ask what he meant, the air shifted violently, the shadows curling inward as an unearthly sound filled the room. It was a low, guttural noise, like the growl of a beast that had been disturbed from its slumber. The amulet seemed to pulse in Elliot's hand, its energy palpable. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. Elliot's grip tightened around the amulet, his expression resolute. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. I nodded, forcing my feet to move as we turned toward the stairwell. The shadows followed us, their movements erratic and desperate, as though trying to keep us from leaving. By the time we reached the top, my heart was racing, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Elliot didn't stop until we were back in the corridor, the oppressive weight of the basement lifting slightly as we moved further away. He held the amulet tightly, its presence still unnerving, but somehow less volatile now that we were above ground. "We're close," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. This is the key." I didn't respond, my mind racing with questions and fears I couldn't put into words. As we stepped into the main hall, the familiar shadows of Redwood Manor greeted us once more, their presence a reminder that our journey was far from over. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the candlelight seemed to carry the weight of the curse we were unraveling. And yet, despite the fear that gnawed at the edges of my resolve, I knew there was no turning back. Redwood Manor had drawn us into its depths, and we would not emerge unchanged. The moment we stepped out of the main hall, the manor seemed to shift around us. It was subtle at first, the faint creak of the walls, the way the air grew heavier with each step, but the deeper we ventured, the more palpable its presence became. Redwood Manor was alive in ways that defied logic, its long-forgotten memories seeping into every crack and crevice. I tightened my grip on my notebook, aware that each moment we spent within these walls was a descent further into the unknown. Elliot led the way, his flashlight carving narrow paths through the darkened corridor. His movements were precise, his focus unyielding as he traced the faint outlines of symbols etched into the faded wallpaper. "These markings are older than the manor itself," he murmured, running his gloved fingers over the grooves. "They don't belong here." I nodded, though his words stirred a quiet unease in me. There was something unnatural about the symbols, their jagged lines seeming to pulsate beneath the dim light. They reminded me of the ancient glyphs I'd studied in history books, the ones said to bind restless spirits or summon forces that should never be disturbed. I scribbled a quick sketch in my notebook, careful to capture every detail. The corridor twisted ahead, narrowing into a space barely wide enough for us to pass. The scent of damp wood and decay grew stronger, mingling with the faint traces of ash that lingered in the air. I could hear the rhythmic drip of water somewhere in the distance, its sound echoing faintly against the silence. Elliot paused near a door, its surface worn and splintered, and placed his hand on the rusted handle. The door groaned as it opened, revealing a room that was both haunting and strangely serene. A single lantern hung from the ceiling, its flame flickering weakly as if struggling to survive. The walls were lined with bookshelves, their contents spilling onto the floor in chaotic heaps. At the center of the room stood a small wooden table, its surface cluttered with papers and a cracked porcelain bowl. Elliot stepped inside, his flashlight sweeping across the room. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. There was an intimacy to the room, a sense that it had been untouched for years despite its chaotic state. Elliot didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the table. He reached for a sheet of paper, its edges yellowed and frayed, and held it up to the light. "It's a ledger," he said finally, his voice tinged with curiosity. "Not one we've seen before." I moved closer, peering over his shoulder as he studied the writing. The words were faint, almost illegible, but I could make out a series of names followed by dates. Each entry ended with a single mark, a jagged slash that seemed to cut across the page with deliberate force. "What do you think it means?" I asked, my pulse quickening. Elliot set the ledger down, his jaw tightening. "It's a list," he said simply. "A record of something, or someone." Before I could press further, a sound echoed from the hallway, a soft, rhythmic tapping like footsteps moving deliberately. Elliot's flashlight flickered as he turned sharply toward the door. "Someone's here," he said, his voice low. I felt my chest tighten, the air growing colder around us as the tapping grew louder. "Do we follow it?" I asked, though I already knew Elliot's answer. He was already moving toward the door, his grip on the flashlight firm as he stepped into the corridor. I hesitated, every instinct urging me to stay behind, but I couldn't abandon him, not now. I swallowed my fear and followed, the tapping guiding us deeper into the manor. The hallway stretched ahead, its shadows shifting like restless waves. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving us in silence. Elliot paused, his flashlight sweeping across the walls. "It's close," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. I tried to steady my breathing, aware that every sound I made could betray our presence. We rounded a corner and came upon another door, this one slightly ajar, its hinges rusted but intact. Elliot pushed it open cautiously, revealing a room that seemed frozen in time. A single chair sat in the center, its surface worn and splintered. On the floor lay a scattering of papers, their contents obscured by the faint glow of moonlight filtering through a cracked window. Elliot knelt beside the chair, his fingers brushing against the edge of one paper. "These symbols, they match the ones in the corridor," he said, his voice thoughtful. I moved closer, my eye scanning the room for any clues. The walls were bare, their surfaces marked with faint scratches that resembled claw marks. I couldn't shake the feeling that the room had been used for something dark. As Elliot sifted through the papers, I felt a sudden chill sweep through the room. It wasn't the kind of cold brought by a draft or open window, it was deeper, more oppressive. My breath fogged the air as I turned toward the doorway, my pulse racing. "Elliot," I said, my voice shaking. "Something's here." He looked up sharply, his flashlight sweeping across the room. The beam caught a flicker of movement in the corner, a shadow that seemed to shift and pulse with a life of its own. Elliot rose to his feet, his stance cautious as he approached. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice firm. The shadow lingered, its edges indistinct as it moved slowly toward us. My heart pounded against my ribs, each beat echoing in my ears as I struggled to stay calm. Elliot's flashlight flickered again, casting erratic beams that made the shadow seem larger, almost human in shape. "Who are you?" Elliot asked, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped the room. The shadow didn't respond, its movement slow and deliberate as it advanced. Elliot stepped back, his hand reaching for the amulet in his coat pocket. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, the shadow seemed to retreat, its edges curling inward as though recoiling from the object. The room fell silent once more, the oppressive chill lifting slightly. Elliot turned to me, his expression unreadable. "It's connected to the curse," he said simply. "This house, it's holding something back." I nodded, my throat too dry to respond. Whatever we had just witnessed was beyond comprehension, a glimpse into the depths of Redwood Manor's dark history. Elliot's focus shifted back to the papers, his determination unshaken as he continued to piece together the puzzle. We spent the next hour documenting every detail, every symbol, every faint clue that hinted at the truth. The shadows lingered at the edges of my vision, a constant reminder that we were not alone. As we stepped back into the hallway, the air felt heavier once more, the manor's presence wrapping around us like a shroud. Elliot didn't speak as we made our way back to the main hall, his mind undoubtedly sorting through the fragments of information we had uncovered. I followed silently, my thoughts racing with questions I couldn't begin to articulate. Redwood Manor was a labyrinth of secrets, each turn revealing darker truths than the last. As we stood in the main hall once more, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching us, its unseen eyes following our every move. Elliot turned to me, his gaze steady despite the tension in his features. "We're close," he said, his voice firm. "But there's more to uncover." I nodded, my resolve strengthening despite the fear that gripped my chest. Redwood Manor had drawn us into its depths, and I knew there was no turning back. Each step we took would lead us closer to the truth, and closer to the darkness that awaited us. The manor's grip tightened as we moved deeper into its decaying halls, an invisible pull urging us toward places where light dared not linger. Though I followed Elliot closely, the oppressive silence between us felt heavier with every step. Redwood Manor seemed to breathe, each creak of its floors and sigh of its walls whispering secrets we weren't yet ready to hear. My heart pounded against my ribs, a steady drumbeat reminding me that the world we were delving into was far from rational. Elliot carried the tarnished amulet in his coat pocket, its faint hum almost imperceptible but strangely omnipresent. I tried not to let my imagination take hold, but every now and then I thought I could feel it pulse, as if the object itself had a heartbeat. Elliot seemed resolute, his focus unshaken, but I could tell the weight of the investigation was bearing down on him. He hadn't said much since our encounter in the basement, his thoughts locked away in the impenetrable labyrinth of his mind. We found ourselves standing before another door, this one heavier and more ornate than the others we'd encountered. The carvings along the edges were intricate, depicting swirling patterns that reminded me of the glyphs from earlier. Elliot hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the rusted handle. I couldn't blame him, even from this distance. I felt the energy radiating from whatever lay beyond. Finally, he pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was cavernous, its ceilings high and arched. Rows of shelves lined the walls, each one overflowing with items that seemed trapped in time. The light from Elliot's flashlight danced across tarnished candlesticks, shattered vases, and an assortment of books whose titles had faded into illegibility. In the center of the room stood a large wooden table, its surface crowded with more relics, some mundane, others unnervingly out of place. I stepped closer, my boots echoing in the stillness. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice reverent in the presence of such eerie grandeur. "Storage," Elliot replied, though the words seemed insufficient to describe the room's atmosphere. Or perhaps something more deliberate. His flashlight settled on a box at the far end of the table. It was small and unassuming, its surface worn smooth with age. Elliot reached for it, his movements careful and deliberate. The moment he touched it, a chill swept through the room, as though the air itself recoiled at his intrusion. I took a step back, my pulse quickening as he opened the lid. Inside was a delicate locket, its chain tangled and its surface etched with symbols that resembled those on the door. Elliot held it up to the light, his eyes narrowing as he studied it. "Another piece of the puzzle," he murmured. I couldn't tell whether he was speaking to me or to himself. As I approached the table, my gaze fell on an object that made my stomach churn, a porcelain doll, its face cracked and its glassy eyes staring lifelessly ahead. It was nestled among other items as though it had been tossed aside, but something about it felt deliberate. I reached out tentatively, the hair on my arm standing on end as my fingers brushed against the cold surface. "Be careful," Elliot warned, his tone sharp. I withdrew my hand, though the doll's presence lingered in my mind. Its fragile form seemed oddly animate, as if it were watching us even now. The room grew colder, the shadows creeping further into the corners. Elliot's flashlight flickered, the beam dimming momentarily before returning to full strength. We exchanged a glance, the unspoken question hanging heavily between us: how much of this was the manor itself, and how much was the curse? Elliot continued his examination of the locket while I moved toward one of the shelves. My eye scanned the cluttered rows, settling on a leather-bound book that seemed out of place among the other relics. Its cover bore no title, only a faded emblem resembling a serpent coiled around a key. I pulled it from the shelf, the weight of it solid in my hands. As I opened the book, I was greeted by pages filled with handwritten notes and sketches. The ink had faded over time, but I could still make out illustrations of rituals and symbols that mirrored those we'd seen throughout the manor. One page in particular caught my attention, a depiction of a circle of figures surrounding an altar, their hands raised toward the sky as a shadow loomed above them. "Elliot, look at this," I said, my voice trembling slightly. He joined me, his eyes scanning the page. "It's connected," I continued. "The rituals, the symbols, it's all tied to this place." Elliot nodded, his expression grim. "This isn't just a curse," he said finally. "It's a legacy." Before I could respond, a sound echoed through the room, a faint whisper that seemed to emanate from the walls. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the whisper grew louder, more distinct. Elliot turned sharply, his flashlight sweeping across the room. "We're not alone," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. The whisper morphed into laughter, soft and haunting. It was neither human nor entirely unnatural, a sound that defied categorization. My heart raced as the laughter subsided, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. "Did you see anything?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Elliot shook his head, his gaze scanning the shadows. "Not yet," he replied, though the edge in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely confident in his answer. We continued our search, our movements cautious and deliberate. Every object in the room seemed to carry its own weight, its own story. The locket, the doll, the book, they were fragments of a larger narrative, pieces of a puzzle that refused to reveal itself. Elliot's determination was unwavering, but I could feel the strain in his posture, the weariness that came from confronting the unknown. As we prepared to leave the room, Elliot paused near the table, his attention drawn to a small wooden box tucked beneath a pile of papers. He pulled it free, the lid creaking as he opened it. Inside was a ring, its surface tarnished, but its design intricate. Symbols similar to those on the locket were etched along the band, their lines delicate and precise. "This might be the key," he said, his voice thoughtful. "To what? I'm not sure yet." I nodded, though the weight of his words was difficult to process. The room had offered more questions than answers, its secrets refusing to yield easily. As we stepped back into the corridor, the air felt colder, heavier. Redwood Manor was alive, its presence undeniable, and it seemed determined to keep us within its grasp. Elliot pocketed the ring, his movements careful. "We need to keep going," he said, his voice firm. "There's more to uncover." I followed him into the shadows, my resolve strengthening despite the fear that gripped my chest. The manor was a labyrinth of secrets, its halls stretching endlessly and its darkness deeper than I'd imagined. Each step we took brought us closer to the truth, and closer to whatever awaited us in the depths of Redwood Manor. The air inside Redwood Manor carried a weight of expectation, as if the house itself anticipated our every step. Shadows clung to the corners like restless sentinels, their outlines shifting just out of focus whenever I turned my head. Elliot forged ahead with steady determination, his every movement precise, deliberate. I envied his composure. My hands trembled slightly as I clutched my notebook, the pages already brimming with fragmented sketches and hurried notes. The grand staircase descended behind us, its weathered banisters swallowed by the gloom. We had left the better-lit sections of the manor behind, plunging instead into its more forbidden depths, places marked not only by neglect but by an aura of something far older and darker. The faint hum I'd felt earlier seemed to intensify the closer we got to the hidden rooms below. I couldn't pinpoint its source, but it crept beneath my skin, leaving a trail of unease. "Do you feel that?" I finally asked, my voice breaking the silence. Elliot glanced back at me, his grey eyes sharp in the dim light. "Yes," he said simply, his tone betraying no hesitation. He adjusted his grip on the flashlight and continued down the narrow corridor we had entered. I didn't press him further. Elliot had a way of letting his silences linger like stones dropped into deep water, rippling outward but never fully revealing their depth. Instead, I focused on the walls around us, which had changed drastically from the more stately, ornate design of the upper floors. Here, the plaster was cracked, peeling away to reveal the rough stone beneath. Etchings, older than the manor itself, traced across the surfaces like forgotten scars. The corridor opened into a small antechamber that radiated an almost suffocating stillness. A single lantern hung from a rusty iron hook in the ceiling, its flame flickering weakly but casting just enough light to reveal the room's contents. Against the far wall stood a row of shelves sagging under the weight of time-worn tomes and relics. Beside them, an arched doorway was partially obscured by a heavy curtain of thick velvet, its color long faded into a dull maroon. Elliot approached the shelves without a word, his flashlight's beam methodically scanning the rows of artifacts. I followed hesitantly, my attention caught by the curtain and the faint glimmer of something metallic beyond its folds. "What's this?" I murmured, stepping closer. I pushed the curtain aside, revealing an alcove containing a pedestal carved from dark stone. Atop it rested an intricate urn, its surface adorned with symbols I recognized from the ritual texts we had uncovered earlier. Though I didn't touch it, its presence filled me with an inexplicable sense of dread. It wasn't just an object, it was a vessel, and whatever it contained, it was still very much alive. "Elliot," I called, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to remain calm. He turned immediately, his flashlight sweeping across the alcove. His gaze locked on the urn, and I saw his expression shift, no longer simply analytical, but apprehensive. He approached cautiously, his movements deliberate as he examined the carvings on the pedestal. "It's part of the ritual," he said softly. "An anchor, perhaps." "An anchor for what?" I asked, though I wasn't certain I wanted to hear the answer. Elliot didn't respond, his focus entirely on the urn. He reached into his coat pocket and retrieved the ring, holding it up beside the symbols. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, as if in response to the proximity of the two objects, the air around us seemed to ripple. The flame in the lantern flared briefly before dimming again, casting distorted shadows across the walls. "We're disturbing it," I said, stepping back instinctively. "Good," Elliot replied, his tone resolute. "The only way to understand this curse is to confront it head-on." I envied his certainty. My instinct screamed to leave the alcove behind, to put as much distance as possible between myself and the unsettling relic. But Elliot's unwavering focus grounded me, pulling me back from the edge of panic. He gestured for me to take notes as he examined the pedestal more closely, muttering observations about the symbols and their potential meanings. The hum I had felt earlier grew louder, its frequency resonating through my chest. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, pervasive and inescapable. I looked around the room, half expecting to see the shadows coalescing into forms as they had in the chamber with the altar. But the walls remained still, their silence unnerving in its own way. As I scribbled furiously in my notebook, a sudden noise shattered the quiet, a loud, sharp crack like the snapping of wood. I whipped around to see the curtain billow violently as though caught in a gust of wind, though the air in the chamber remained deathly still. Elliot straightened immediately, his flashlight trained on the alcove. "Something's here," he said, his voice calm but firm. He pocketed the ring once more, his movements precise despite the tension in the room. The hum reached a fever pitch, and before I could react, the urn began to tremble atop its pedestal. Fine cracks spread across its surface, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I was rooted in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the spectacle unfolding before me. "Stay back," Elliot commanded, stepping between me and the alcove. The light emanating from the urn grew brighter, pulsing in time with the hum. The room seemed to warp around us, the walls bending as though viewed through rippling water. And then, with a deafening sound that felt less like a shatter and more like a release, the urn cracked open. A surge of energy erupted from the pedestal, washing over us like a tidal wave. The lantern above flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness save for the faint, glowing remnants of the shattered urn. I stumbled backward, my notebook slipping from my grasp as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. From the remnants of the urn rose a shape, a figure shrouded in shadow, its form indistinct but undeniably present. It radiated an aura of malevolence that made the air in the room feel suffocating. My chest tightened, each breath a struggle as the figure turned its attention toward us. Elliot didn't flinch. He held his ground, the flashlight in his hand unwavering. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the overwhelming presence before us. The figure didn't respond in words, but the hum seemed to shift, its tone becoming almost melodic, an unsettling, otherworldly song that resonated in the very fabric of the room. I felt my knees weaken, my balance faltering as the figure advanced slightly. "Answer me!" Elliot shouted, his voice cutting through the oppressive sound. For a moment, the figure paused. The shadows around it swirled, their movements chaotic but purposeful. And then, in a voice that seemed to emerge from everywhere and nowhere, it spoke. "You cannot undo what has been done." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. My heart pounded as I tried to process their meaning, but the figure didn't wait for a response. It raised one shadowy arm, and the hum returned, louder and more dissonant than before. The room seemed to tremble under its weight, the stone walls groaning as though on the verge of collapse. Elliot reacted quickly, pulling the ring from his pocket and holding it up toward the figure. The hum faltered, its rhythm breaking as the figure recoiled slightly. "This curse binds you," Elliot said, his voice firm. "But it also gives me power over you." The figure hesitated, its form flickering as though caught between two states. The shadows around it writhed, their movements frantic. I could feel the tension in the room reach its peak, the air crackling with energy as Elliot stood his ground. For what felt like an eternity, the figure remained still. And then, slowly, it began to retreat, its form dissolving into the darkness. The hum faded with it, leaving behind a deafening silence that seemed almost unreal after the chaos of the last few moments. Elliot exhaled slowly, lowering the ring. His hand trembled slightly, the only sign of the strain he had endured. I remained frozen, my mind struggling to catch up with what had just transpired. "Are you all right?" Elliot asked, his voice breaking the silence. I nodded shakily, my legs finally finding the strength to support me. "What was that?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot didn't answer immediately. He turned his gaze toward the shattered urn, his expression contemplative. "We've awakened something," he said at last. "Something that's been waiting for far too long." He placed the ring back into his pocket and turned toward the corridor, his movements deliberate but unhurried. "Come on, Miguel," he said, his tone steady but heavy with meaning. "We're not finished here." I hesitated for a moment before following him, the weight of the encounter pressing heavily on my mind. The shadows of Redwood Manor seemed to press closer as we left the antechamber behind, their silent watchfulness a reminder that our journey was far from over. The atmosphere of Redwood Manor thickened as Elliot and I ventured into yet another shadowed corridor, this time toward the east wing, a section that had remained inexplicably untouched in our previous explorations. It was as though the manor itself had shifted, revealing new layers and passageways we hadn't noticed before. The very walls seemed to thrum with an unseen pulse, an uncanny echo that mirrored the tension coursing through us. Elliot walked ahead with measured steps, the beam of his flashlight illuminating jagged scratches etched deep into the wooden panels lining the corridor. Each mark seemed deliberate, as though someone, or something, had scrawled them with purpose. I lingered near one particularly intricate pattern, my fingers hovering just shy of the surface. "These symbols," I murmured, "they look like they've been carved by hand, but the depth—" "They're not random," Elliot interrupted. His voice was sharp but composed, layered with the kind of insight he wielded effortlessly. "There's intent behind them, Miguel." "Ritual markings, maybe." I nodded slowly, but the pit in my stomach widened. It wasn't merely the marks on the wall or the creak of the floor beneath our feet, it was the feeling that we were being led deeper, drawn forward by an invisible force we had no way of understanding. The corridor ended abruptly at a door I hadn't seen before. It was smaller and less ornate than the others in the manor, its surface scarred and worn with time. Elliot stopped short, his gloved hand resting on the rusted brass handle. He glanced back at me, his gaze steady, his voice low and resolute. "It's here." I stepped closer, swallowing my apprehension as I joined him. The door groaned in protest as he pushed it open, revealing a staircase that spiraled downward into darkness. The smell of earth and decay drifted up to meet us, heavier and more oppressive than anything we'd encountered so far. "Let me guess," I said dryly, though my humor felt hollow even to myself. "The curse doesn't reside upstairs in the parlor." Elliot didn't dignify my remark with a response. Instead, he began his descent, his movements deliberate but swift. I followed reluctantly, clutching my notebook and pen like talismans against the encroaching dark. The steps seemed endless, the spiral so tight that the walls pressed inward, their damp surfaces brushing against my shoulders. I wanted to speak, to break the suffocating silence, but something held me back, as though even words would invite disaster. I focused instead on Elliot's back, his figure framed by the faint glow of his flashlight. We emerged into a cavernous chamber, its floor uneven stone and its walls lost to shadow. In the center stood a massive, crumbling pillar, its surface engraved with more symbols, each one more intricate than the last. The room was cold, not the brisk chill of autumn air, but the kind of cold that seeped into your marrow and stayed there. Elliot approached the pillar, his movements deliberate. The flashlight's beam danced across its surface, revealing faint traces of dried blood smeared among the carvings. My stomach turned at the sight, and I fought to keep my composure as I moved closer. "This isn't just ritualistic," Elliot said, his voice steady but dark. "It's sacrificial." The word hung in the air, heavier than the shadows that surrounded us. I looked away from the pillar, my gaze falling on the remnants of what might have once been offerings, scraps of cloth, shattered bones, fragments of porcelain. They were scattered haphazardly, but their presence told a story I didn't want to read. Elliot crouched near the base of the pillar, his hands tracing the carvings with a methodical precision. "This curse, it's tied to more than just the manor," he murmured, half to himself. "It's something ancient, something inherited." "Inherited by the family?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my attempt at control. "By their bloodline," Elliot replied. "And they've been feeding it, Miguel. Keeping it alive." A sudden noise startled me, a faint shuffle, like the sound of fabric brushing against stone. I turned sharply, my flashlight sweeping across the chamber, but there was nothing. The shadows remained still, undisturbed. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my pulse quickening. Elliot straightened, his expression unreadable. "I did." We exchanged a glance before moving toward the far side of the chamber, where a narrow passage extended into further darkness. The air was colder here, heavier, and the walls seemed closer together despite the width of the corridor. I tightened my grip on my flashlight, aware that my hands were shaking. The passage opened into another room, smaller than the chamber, but no less ominous. In its center stood an altar, its surface cracked, but intact. Symbols were carved deeply into the stone, their edges worn smooth by time. Around it lay more remnants, bones, scraps of cloth, and a single tarnished mirror resting against the base. Elliot moved to the altar, his focus unyielding as he examined the carvings. "This is the nexus," he said, his voice steady. "This is where the curse was bound and reborn." I swallowed hard, my gaze fixed on the mirror. Its surface was clouded, but I could see faint outlines in the glass, shapes that seemed to shift and writhe like smoke caught in a breeze. I reached out instinctively, my fingertips brushing the cold metal frame before Elliot's voice stopped me. "Don't touch it," he said sharply, his tone commanding. I withdrew my hand, but the mirror's presence continued to haunt me. It wasn't just an object, it was alive, pulsing with an energy I couldn't understand. Elliot reached into his coat pocket and retrieved the ring, holding it up toward the altar. The air shifted immediately, the hum returning with a vengeance. The shadows in the room seemed to recoil, their movements frantic and chaotic. "Get behind me," Elliot ordered, his voice firm but calm. I obeyed without hesitation, clutching my notebook to my chest like a shield. The ring glowed faintly in the dim light, its energy growing stronger as Elliot held it closer to the altar. The hum reached a deafening pitch, and the shadows coalesced, their forms taking shape along the edges of the room. They weren't solid, not fully, but their presence was undeniable. The room trembled, the vibration so strong that I struggled to keep my footing. The mirror reflected the chaos, its surface alive with flickering images that seemed to shift too quickly to comprehend. Elliot's voice cut through the noise, steady and commanding. "This curse, it's tied to this place, to these relics. But it's more than that. It's bound to them, the ones who made the pact." The shadows surged forward, their movements violent and erratic. Elliot stepped back, his grip on the ring tightening as he raised it higher. The air crackled with energy, the hum reverberating through every inch of the room. And then, from the center of the altar, a figure emerged, a shape shrouded in darkness but unmistakably human. It carried an aura of malevolence so strong that I felt my chest tighten, my breath catching in my throat. The figure spoke, its voice a low, guttural rumble that seemed to echo from the very stones beneath us. "You cannot undo what has been done." The words hung heavily in the air, each syllable resonating with finality. Elliot didn't flinch, his resolve unshaken as he held the ring aloft. "I don't intend to undo it," he replied, his voice steady. but I will confront it. The figure hesitated, its movement slow and deliberate. The shadows around it writhed, their forms flickering as they surged toward Elliot. I watched in helpless silence, unable to move as the energy in the room reached its peak. Elliot's grip on the ring tightened, and the glow intensified. The shadows recoiled, their forms unraveling as the figure faltered. The hum began to fade, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed heavily against my ears. The figure dissolved, its form evaporating into the darkness. The shadows followed suit, their movements frantic but fleeting. The energy in the room dissipated, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost unreal. Elliot lowered the ring, his breath heavy but controlled. He turned to me, his expression resolute. "This isn't over," he said, his voice firm. "But we've weakened it." I nodded, my mind racing with questions I couldn't yet articulate. Redwood Manor had revealed another piece of its puzzle, but the answers remained elusive. All I knew was that the curse was far more insidious than I had ever imagined. The oppressive silence in Redwood Manor had deepened, thickening the air with an intangible weight that pressed heavily on my chest. Elliot moved with purpose, his flashlight cutting narrow beams through the darkness as he retraced his steps to the eastern wing where we'd first encountered the shattered urn. I followed closely, the pages of my notebook heavy in my grip, my thoughts racing as I struggled to reconcile the fragments of this cursed legacy. Each creak of the floorboards beneath our boots felt amplified, reverberating through the manor like the desperate whispers of something unseen. I couldn't shake the feeling that every sound we made was being catalogued, filed away by the entity that lingered in the periphery of our investigation. Elliot remained resolute, his movements deliberate and steady. But even he couldn't mask the faint tension in his shoulders. We reached the chamber where the altar had been revealed, the room now darker than I remembered, its torchlight flickering unevenly. Shadows pulled at the edges of the walls, their movements disjointed, as if caught in a perpetual cycle of frustration. Elliot didn't pause, his flashlight fixing on the altar like a beacon. The remnants of the urn still lay scattered across the cold stone floor, their faint glow diminished but persistent. The altar itself was unsettlingly unchanged, its carvings of arcane symbols sharp against the fading light. I hesitated before crossing the threshold, my instincts screaming against the growing sense of something restless within. Elliot set his flashlight down, the beam directed at the center of the altar. He retrieved the ring from his pocket, the tarnished band gleaming faintly as he held it up to the carvings. The air shifted immediately, the energy palpable, vibrating through the room like an unsteady heartbeat. "It's the key," he muttered, half to himself. "But it's also the anchor." I stepped closer, my breath shallow as I watched him trace the edges of the ring against the symbols. "What happens if we move it?" I asked quietly, unsure whether I wanted the answer. "We don't move it," Elliot replied. His voice was steady, but there was an edge, an unspoken understanding of the danger we were facing. "We use it to confront whatever lies beneath this curse." Before I could respond, the shadows along the walls shifted violently. They surged inward, their forms bending and twisting like smoke caught in a storm. The torchlight flared, casting jagged patterns across the room as the temperature plummeted. I felt the hairs on my arms rise, my heartbeat quickening as I struggled to maintain my composure. The shadows coalesced, forming shapes that defied description, distorted figures that flickered and writhed like reflections on shattered glass. Elliot didn't flinch, his focus fixed on the ring and the altar. I stepped back instinctively, the chill of the room settling deep into my bones. One of the figures advanced, its outline vaguely humanoid, but utterly alien in its movements. It radiated an aura of something ancient, something heavy with intention. Elliot raised the ring higher, his voice cutting through the oppressive air. "Show yourself," he demanded. "No more shadows. No more fragments. Show me your true form." The figure hesitated, its movements faltering. The room trembled, the vibrations spreading outward from the altar like ripples on a darkened lake. The other figures paused as well, their focus fixed on Elliot and the ring he held. I could feel the weight of their collective attention, their presence pressing against every corner of the room. And then, slowly, the figure shifted. The shadows peeled away, revealing a shape more distinct, but no less unnerving. It was human-like in form, but its features were distorted, fragmented by the curse that bound it. Its eyes burned with an unnatural light, and its expression carried the weight of endless suffering. Elliot didn't waver. He held the ring firmly, his voice steady as he addressed the figure. "This curse is tied to you. To your choices. It's sustained by the sacrifices made here. But it can be broken." The figure's gaze shifted, its movement slow and deliberate. It didn't speak, not in words, but the energy in the room seemed to change, carrying an unspoken question, a demand for explanation. Elliot stepped closer to the altar, his determination unwavering. "You bound your family to this curse for power," he continued. "For control. But that power has consumed you." I watched in silence, my pulse racing as the figure reacted. Its form flickered, the shadows pulling at its edges like restless tides. The torchlight dimmed, casting long shadows across the room as the air grew heavier. Elliot remained resolute, his grip on the ring tightening as he continued. "This house. This curse. It doesn't have to define your legacy." The figure's expression twisted, its burning eyes narrowing as the shadows surged forward. Elliot raised the ring higher, the tarnished band glowing faintly as the energy intensified. I stepped back, my instincts screaming against the oppressive weight of the room. And then, with a sudden burst of movement, the figure lunged toward the altar. The shadows followed, their forms bending and twisting as they converged on Elliot. He didn't falter, his voice cutting through the chaos as he addressed the figure. "You've held on to this for too long." The room trembled violently, the vibration spreading outward in waves. The torchlight flared, casting erratic patterns across the walls as the shadows recoiled. The figure paused, its movements frantic but uncertain. Elliot stepped forward, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Release it." The figure hesitated, its burning gaze fixed on the ring. The shadows twisted violently, their movements desperate and chaotic. And then, slowly, the figure began to retreat. The energy in the room shifted, the oppressive weight lifting slightly as the shadows unraveled. Elliot lowered the ring, his breath heavy but controlled. The figure faded into the darkness, its presence lingering like a distant echo. The torchlight stabilized, casting steady beams across the room as the silence returned. I exhaled shakily, my knees weak as I leaned against the wall for support. Elliot turned to me, his expression resolute. "It's weakened," he said simply. "But not gone." I nodded, my mind racing with questions I couldn't yet articulate. Redwood Manor had revealed another piece of its puzzle, but the answers remained elusive. All I knew was that the curse was far more insidious than I had ever imagined. Elliot pocketed the ring once more, his movements careful. He turned toward the doorway, his focus unyielding as he addressed me. "Come on, Miguel," he said firmly. "We're not done yet." I followed him into the shadows, the weight of the encounter pressing heavily on my thoughts. The manor's watchful presence lingered, its silence heavy with secrets yet to be uncovered. And as we stepped further into its depths, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The air in Redwood Manor felt heavier than ever before. It wasn't just the humidity or the pervasive chill that clung to my skin, it was the weight of something unseen, something lurking just beyond the veil of perception. Each step through the manor's narrow corridors felt deliberate, as though the house was guiding us toward an inevitable conclusion. Elliot walked ahead, his flashlight casting long shadows across the walls marked with the scars of the past. I followed, my notebook clutched tightly, the words I had written earlier now appearing fragmented and incomplete, as though they too had succumbed to the labyrinthine nature of this place. We had returned to the east wing, retracing our steps through the same corridor where the grotesque carvings first appeared. Elliot's silence was as palpable as the shifting shadows around us, his focus laser-sharp, his movements precise. I could see the faint tension in his jaw, the slight twitch in his fingers as he gripped the ring, a relic that had become our reluctant ally in unraveling this curse. "I can feel it," he muttered, his voice low but steady. "The house is responding." "To the ring?" I asked hesitantly, though the answer seemed obvious. Elliot didn't reply immediately, his gaze fixed on the wall ahead. The faint scratching sound echoed around us, growing louder, more insistent. "Yes," he said finally. "And to us." The corridor led us to another doorway, its wood warped and splintered, the brass handle corroded with age. Elliot hesitated for a brief moment before pushing it open, the hinges groaning as the door swung inward to reveal what appeared to be a study, or at least what was left of one. The room was small, its walls lined with decaying shelves that sagged under the weight of ancient tomes. A desk stood in the center, its surface littered with yellowed papers and broken quills. The faint scent of ink and mildew hung in the air, mingling with the omnipresent undertone of decay. Elliot stepped inside, his flashlight sweeping across the disarray. "Another piece," he murmured, his tone thoughtful. He moved toward the desk, his eyes scanning the scattered papers. I lingered near the shelves, my gaze drawn to the titles etched into the spines of the books. Most were illegible, the text worn away by time, but a few stood out, names that carried weight, names that stirred the memory of the stories my grandmother had told me as a child. Tales of curses, of rituals, of shadows bound by oaths too dark to comprehend. "Look at this," Elliot called, beckoning me to join him at the desk. I crossed the room cautiously, my heart racing as I approached. He held up a piece of paper, its edges frayed, the ink faded but still legible. The words were scrawled in a jagged script, their meaning obscure at first glance. "What does it say?" I asked, leaning closer. Elliot read aloud, his voice steady but tinged with unease. "The pact holds, and the price is paid. To break the chain, one must replace what was given." The sentence hung heavily in the room, its implication sinking deep into my chest. "Replace what was given?" I echoed, my voice trembling slightly. "A sacrifice," Elliot said simply, his tone devoid of emotion. Before I could respond, the scratching sound grew louder, its source closer now, more distinct. I turned sharply, my flashlight illuminating the corner of the room. Nothing moved, but the shadows seemed heavier, their presence more deliberate. Elliot pocketed the paper and motioned for me to follow. "It's time to move," he said, his voice firm. "We're being watched." We stepped back into the corridor, the air colder now, the scratching sound accompanying our every step. It felt as though the walls themselves were alive, their surface shifting imperceptibly, breathing in our presence. Elliot didn't pause, his flashlight cutting a path through the darkness. The corridor led us to yet another door, this one larger, heavier, its surface carved with intricate patterns that mirrored the symbols on the altar and the pillar we had encountered earlier. Elliot hesitated, his hand resting on the handle, his gaze fixed on the carvings. "This is it," he said quietly. "The heart of the curse." I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening as I nodded in silent agreement. Elliot pushed the door open, and the sight that greeted us took my breath away. The room was massive, its walls lined with shelves that stretched to the vaulted ceiling, their contents lost to the shadows. In the center stood a circle carved into the stone floor, its grooves filled with a substance that gleamed faintly in the dim light. Around the circle lay relics, an urn, a mirror, a ring, and other items whose presence carried an undeniable weight. They seemed to radiate energy, their forms pulsing faintly as though alive. Elliot stepped inside, his movement slow but deliberate. He approached the circle, his flashlight illuminating the carvings that surrounded it. "This is where it happened," he said softly. "The Nexus." I followed cautiously, my attention drawn to the relics. Each one carried an air of significance, their presence too deliberate to be coincidental. I felt the weight of their history pressing against my chest, their stories etched into the fabric of this place. Elliot reached for the ring, holding it up as he stepped closer to the circle. The air shifted immediately, the energy in the room intensifying. The shadows along the walls surged inward, their forms bending and twisting violently. The torchlight flickered, casting erratic beams across the room. The scratching sound returned, louder now, more insistent. It wasn't just noise, it was a language, a communication that defied comprehension. Elliot didn't flinch, his grip on the ring tightening as he addressed the shadows. "You're tied to this," he said firmly. "Bound by choice and sustained by sacrifice." The shadows writhed, their movements frantic and chaotic. The relics pulsed, their energy growing stronger as the scratching sound reached a fever pitch. I stepped back instinctively, my instincts screaming against the overwhelming presence in the room. Elliot raised the ring higher, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Show yourself," he demanded. "No more fragments. No more echoes." The room trembled, the vibration spreading outward in waves. The shadows coalesced, forming shapes that flickered and shifted like reflections on shattered glass. A figure emerged from the circle, its form shrouded in darkness, its presence suffocating. It spoke, its voice a guttural rumble that resonated in the very bones of the manor. "You cannot break what was made." Elliot didn't waver, his gaze fixed on the figure. "We can confront it," he said, his voice steady. "And we can end it." The figure hesitated, its movement slow and deliberate. The shadows surged forward, their forms bending and twisting as they converged on the circle. The room trembled violently, the torchlight flaring as the energy reached its peak. Elliot stood his ground, the ring glowing faintly in his hand. The scratching sound intensified, its tone dissonant, chaotic. And then, with a sudden burst of movement, the figure dissolved, its form unraveling into the shadows. The room fell silent, the energy dissipating as the relics dimmed. Elliot lowered the ring, his breath heavy but controlled. He turned to me, his expression resolute. "We're close," he said simply. "But it's not over." I nodded, my mind racing as we stepped back into the corridor. The weight of the manor pressed against me, its presence heavy with secrets yet to be uncovered. And as we ventured deeper into its depths, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The air in Redwood Manor was heavier than ever, thick with the weight of its secrets and the echoes of its history. Every step forward felt like a battle against an invisible tide, as if the manor itself was reluctant to let us reach its core. Elliot moved ahead with unyielding determination, the ring gripped tightly in his gloved hand. Its faint glow had grown stronger, pulsating in rhythm with the tremors that seemed to vibrate through the floor. I followed close behind, my own resolve faltering with every shift of the shadows around us. My notebook hung limp in my hand. There was little use for words now. The truth of this place was not something I could capture in ink. It was alive, breathing in the walls, pulsing beneath the floorboards. It existed beyond the boundaries of language. "This is it, Miguel," Elliot said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "This is where it ends." I nodded, though my throat felt too tight to speak. The corridor we walked seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly into the darkness. The flickering of Elliot's flashlight cast distorted shapes on the walls, shapes that twisted and writhed like living things. I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the light or something more sinister. At this point, I wasn't sure it mattered. We reached the door at the end of the corridor, a massive, ornate barrier carved with the now familiar symbols of the curse. They seemed almost to writhe under Elliot's flashlight, their edges sharp and glistening like freshly spilled ink. He paused, his breathing steady but deliberate, and placed a hand on the handle. "Are you ready?" he asked, glancing back at me. There was no fear in his eyes, only an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot pushed the door open, and we stepped into the heart of the manor. The chamber was vast, more a cathedral than a room. The ceiling arched high above us, lost to the darkness, while the walls were lined with flickering torches that bathed the room in a dim, golden light. At the center of the space stood a towering monolith of black stone, its surface etched with the same intricate carvings that had haunted us throughout our journey. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, each breath a labor against the weight of unseen forces. Around the monolith, a circle of relics had been meticulously arranged, the shattered urn, the tarnished mirror, the locket, and the ring. Each object glowed faintly, their energies intertwining in a dance that felt both chaotic and deliberate. At the base of the monolith, a shallow basin overflowed with a dark, viscous liquid that shimmered unnaturally in the torchlight. Elliot stepped forward, his every movement calculated, and placed the ring within the circle. The moment it touched the ground, the energy in the room shifted violently. The torches flared, their flames roaring as if caught in a gale, and the shadows surged inward, coalescing around the monolith in a swirling maelstrom of darkness. I stumbled back, my heart hammering as the shadows took shape. Figures emerged from the void, distorted, fragmented, their forms flickering like images on a broken screen. Their eyes burned with an unnatural light, and their movements were slow but purposeful. Elliot stood his ground, his flashlight steady in his hand. "You bound yourselves to this curse," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "But it can end here. Release it." The figures didn't respond, their forms shifting and merging with the shadows. The air grew colder, the temperature plummeting as frost crept along the floor. The relics began to pulse more intensely, their light casting eerie patterns across the chamber. One of the figures stepped forward, its outline vaguely human but impossibly distorted. It spoke, its voice a guttural echo that reverberated through the room. "The chain cannot be broken. The price must be paid." Elliot didn't flinch. He reached into his coat and retrieved the notebook we had filled with our discoveries, holding it up as if presenting evidence in a courtroom. "You fed this curse for generations," he said. "With sacrifices, with blood. But the chain is not immutable. You are its anchor, and you can let it go." The figure hesitated, its burning eyes flickering. The other shadows seemed to ripple in response, their movements chaotic and disjointed. The energy in the room was palpable now, a storm of light and darkness that threatened to consume everything. Elliot stepped closer to the monolith, his voice rising above the cacophony. "This house, this curse, it doesn't have to define you. Break the chain." The shadows surged violently, their forms writhing as if in agony. The room trembled, the vibration spreading outward like waves. The relics began to glow brighter, their light intensifying as the energy reached its peak. And then, with a deafening roar, the monolith cracked. The sound was like a thunderclap, shattering the oppressive silence and sending shockwaves through the chamber. The relics exploded in bursts of light, their energy surging toward the monolith and fracturing it further. The shadows recoiled, their forms unraveling as the bonds of the curse began to break. Elliot stood his ground, his flashlight illuminating the cracks that spread across the monolith like veins of light. The figures dissolved into the darkness, their forms dissipating as the curse unraveled. The basin at the base of the monolith overflowed, its liquid evaporating into wisps of smoke that rose toward the ceiling. The light from the relics grew brighter, illuminating the chamber in a blinding glow that forced me to shield my eyes. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos ceased. The chamber fell silent, the oppressive energy lifting like a weight from my chest. The monolith was gone, reduced to a pile of shattered stone, and the relics lay dark and inert. The torches burned steadily, their light warm and steady. Elliot turned to me, his expression weary but resolute. "It's done," he said quietly. I nodded, unable to find words. The manor, for the first time since we had arrived, felt still. The air was clear, the silence no longer oppressive, but peaceful. I looked around the chamber, taking in the remnants of what had transpired. As we made our way back through the corridors of Redwood Manor, the shadows no longer followed us. The oppressive weight that had clung to the house was gone, replaced by a sense of quiet finality. The manor's curse had been broken, its legacy undone. We stepped outside into the cool night air, the stars shining brightly above. I took a deep breath, the fresh air filling my lungs as I looked back at the manor. It stood in silence, its windows dark and empty, a monument to the secrets it had held for so long. Elliot placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "You did well, Miguel," he said. "We both did." I nodded, a faint smile crossing my lips as I looked toward the horizon. The road stretched out before us, endless and full of possibility. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt free. As we walked away from Redwood Manor, the wind carried the faintest whisper, a final farewell from a house that had finally found peace.